The smoke from the Longhouse chimneys cut through the morning mist like accusing fingers, each wisp a reminder of the warmth Astrid would never feel again. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her with a finality that echoed across the fjord. Her bare feet found purchase on the frost-covered stones as the elder's words still rang in her ears. "You have brought shame upon this house. You are no daughter of ours." The woolen cloak around her shoulders offered little protection against the biting Norwegian wind that swept down from the mountains. November in Vestfold was merciless, and the gray sky promised snow before nightfall. Astrid pulled the fabric tighter, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated as quickly as her former life. "Astrid, wait!" The voice belonged to her younger sister Sigrid, who had slipped out through the servants' entrance. Her face was streaked with tears, and she clutched a small leather pouch. "Take this. It's all I could gather. Some dried fish, a fire steel, and Mother's silver arm ring." Astrid's throat tightened. The arm ring had been their grandmother's, passed down through generations of women who had never known the sting of exile. "I cannot take this from you, sister."
Father will. Father has lost his mind to pride and politics, Sigrid whispered fiercely.
The alliance with Jarl Thorvald's son was worth more to him than his own daughter's honor. "You spoke the truth about Eric's cruelty, and for that you've been cast out." The memory of that night still burned fresh in Astrid's mind. She had witnessed Eric striking a servant girl, had seen the bruises on the young woman's arms, and when the girl had begged for her help, Astrid had done what her heart demanded. She had confronted him publicly, calling him unfit to lead men who could not control his own base impulses. "Promise me you'll survive this," Sigrid pleaded, pressing the pouch into Astrid's trembling hands. "Promise me you'll find a way to show them all that they were wrong about you." Astrid nodded, unable to trust her voice. She embraced her sister one final time before turning away toward the tree line. Each step took her further from everything she had ever known, deeper into the wilderness that stretched endlessly toward the mountains. The first day was the hardest. Without the protection of the Longhouse walls, every gust of wind felt like ice daggers against her skin. She followed deer paths through the dense forest of spruce and birch, their bare branches creating a skeletal canopy overhead. The ground beneath her feet was treacherous, fallen leaves, hidden roots, and patches of early frost that crunched with each footfall. By afternoon, hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she rationed the dried fish carefully. She paused by a small stream to drink, the water so cold it made her teeth ache, and caught her reflection in the dark surface. Her long blonde hair had come loose from its braids, framing a face that bore the high cheekbones and proud bearing of her lineage. But her blue eyes, once bright with laughter, now held the hollow look of someone who had lost everything. As darkness approached, Astrid found a shallow cave in the hillside, its entrance partially hidden by a fallen log. She gathered what dry wood she could find and managed to coax a small fire to life. The flames danced against the stone walls, creating shadows that seemed to mock her solitude. She wrapped her cloak tighter and tried to ignore the sounds of the forest at night, the distant howl of wolves, the rustle of creatures in the underbrush. Sleep came in fitful snatches, interrupted by cold and the weight of her circumstances. In her dreams, she was back in the great hall, surrounded by the warmth of family. But each time she woke, reality crashed over her like a cold wave. She was alone, cast out with nothing but her own will to keep her alive. The second day brought snow, large flakes that fell silently through the canopy and began to accumulate on the forest floor. Astrid's footsteps became more difficult to place, and the cold seeped through her worn boots. She found a handful of late berries, their tartness a small mercy against the bland dried fish, but food was becoming a pressing concern. It was then that she heard them, the deep voices of men, the jingle of weapons and horse tackle. Astrid pressed herself behind a large pine tree, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the falling snow, she could make out a group of warriors on horseback, their breath and that of their mounts creating clouds in the frigid air. At their head rode a man who commanded attention even from a distance. He sat his horse like he had been born to it, his broad shoulders draped in a magnificent wolf fur cloak. A silver torque gleamed at his throat, and the intricate patterns on his leather armor spoke of both wealth and status. Even through the snow, Astrid could see the sharp lines of his face, the way his dark eyes seemed to take in everything with the intensity of a predator. This could only be Jarl Magnus Eriksson, whose name was spoken in whispers throughout Vestfold and beyond. Stories of his prowess in battle, His successful raids across the North Sea and his fierce independence had reached even her father's hall. He was a man who had carved his own path through the world with sword and cunning. Astrid held her breath as the party passed within arm's reach of her hiding place. She had almost convinced herself she was safe when her foot slipped on ice beneath the snow. The sharp crack of a breaking branch echoed through the forest like a thunderclap. Magnus's head snapped toward the sound with predatory swiftness. His hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt as his pale blue eyes scanned the forest. "Hold," he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, hunter and hunted regarded each other through the falling snow. Astrid could see the intelligence in the Jarl's gaze as he assessed her, taking in her fine wool cloak, now torn and stained, the proud set of her shoulders despite her obvious desperation, and the defiant tilt of her chin that refused to acknowledge defeat even in the face of certain discovery. "Come out," Magnus said finally, his tone neither threatening nor gentle. "The forest is no place for a woman alone, especially not in weather such as this." Astrid stepped out from behind the tree, snow clinging to her hair and cloak, her chin raised in unconscious mimicry of her noble upbringing. "I am not lost, my lord," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I go where I choose to go." A smile tugged at the corner of Magnus's mouth, not mocking but intrigued. "Indeed? And where does a highborn lady choose to go when she wanders the wilderness alone, with winter's teeth already biting at her heels?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Around them, the snow continued to fall, each flake a reminder that time was running short, that the choice she made in this moment would determine whether she lived to see another dawn. Magnus dismounted with fluid grace, his boots crunching softly in the fresh snow as he approached. His warriors remained mounted but alert, hands resting casually on weapon hilts. Astrid forced herself to stand straight, drawing on every lesson in deportment her mother had ever given her, even as her bare toes grew numb inside her worn boots. "You speak like nobility, yet you travel like an outlaw," Magnus observed, stopping just outside arm's reach. Up close, she could see the silver threads in his dark beard, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, and the way his pale eyes seemed to catalog every detail. "That cloak bears the weave of Vestfold, yet here you stand, alone in the wilderness with snow melting in your hair. Perhaps some nobility prefer honest exile to dishonest comfort, my lord." "Exile?" The word rolled off Magnus's tongue with understanding. "What crime did you commit that earned you such a harsh sentence?" "I spoke truth when lies would have been more convenient," Astrid replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I chose justice over politics. My father found this disagreeable to his plans." One of the mounted warriors, a grizzled man with arms like tree trunks, leaned forward in his saddle. "Jarl, the storm grows worse. We should reach the hall before full darkness falls." Magnus raised a hand without looking away from Astrid. "Tell me your name, truth speaker." "Astrid Harold's daughter." She lifted her chin higher as if the name still carried weight. Recognition flickered in Magnus's eyes. "Harold the Red's daughter. I heard rumors of a disrupted betrothal, political upheaval in his hall." His expression grew thoughtful. "What truth did you speak that cost you so dearly?" The memory brought heat to Astrid's cheeks despite the cold. Erik Thorvaldsson struck a servant girl for spilling wine on his sleeve. When she came to me with bruises, I confronted him before the entire hall. I told him that a man who beats those weaker than himself is unfit to lead others. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I called him a coward who hides his weakness behind his father's name. Magnus's warriors exchanged glances, some surprised, others impressed. The grizzled one let out a low whistle. Bold words for a woman speaking to her betrothed. "Your father chose politics over his daughter's honor," Magnus said finally. "Erik's father chose to demand your exile rather than address his son's failings. And you chose to stand by your principles despite the cost. I would choose the same again," Astrid said firmly, though her voice cracked slightly on the last word. The cold was seeping deeper into her bones, and she could feel herself beginning to shiver despite her efforts to appear strong. Magnus noticed immediately. In one swift motion, he unclasped his wolf fur cloak and stepped forward. "Here." Astrid stepped back instinctively. "I need no pity from you, my lord." "Good," Magnus replied, still holding out the cloak. "Because I offer none. I offer warmth to someone who has proven herself worthy of respect." His voice grew serious, You will not survive another night in the open, Astrid, Harold's daughter. The storm that approaches will kill you as surely as any blade. As if summoned by his words, a fierce gust of wind swept through the trees, sending snow swirling around them. Astrid's teeth began to chatter, and she wrapped her arms around herself in a futile attempt to conserve warmth. You have choices, Magnus continued. You can accept my hospitality and live to fight another day, or you can maintain your pride and become another casualty of winter's indifference. The logic was undeniable, but accepting help from a stranger carried its own dangers. And what would you ask in return for this shelter? Nothing you are unwilling to give, he replied simply. You would be a guest in my hall, bound by the laws of hospitality that are sacred to our people. No harm would come to you under my roof. Astrid searched his face for deception, for the calculating look she had learned to recognize in men who saw opportunity in desperation. Instead, she found only steady patience and what seemed to be genuine respect. I accept your offer, she said finally, taking the proffered cloak. The wolf fur was still warm from his body, and she couldn't suppress a small sigh of relief as it settled around her shoulders. Magnus nodded to his men, and one of them brought forward a smaller horse, a sturdy mare with kind eyes.
Can you ride?
I was raised in a warrior's hall, Astrid replied with a hint of her old spirit. I could ride before I could properly walk. As they set off through the deepening snow, Astrid found herself riding beside the Jarl while his warriors flanked them protectively. The wind had picked up considerably, turning the snowfall into a proper blizzard that reduced visibility to mere feet. Tell me about your hall, she said, partly to distract herself from the cold. It sits on a hill overlooking the fjord, Magnus replied. Stone foundations, timber walls, and a great hearth that burns day and night. My people are loyal, my defenses are strong, and my table is generous to both friend and stranger. And your enemies? Magnus glanced at her with approval. Are numerous and well-advised to remain at a distance. His expression grew serious. You should know that by accepting my hospitality, you may be drawing their attention. Your father's political maneuverings have made him allies among those who would prefer to see me weakened. They crested a hill, and through the swirling snow, Astrid caught her first glimpse of Magnus's hall. It was magnificent, a massive structure of stone and timber that seemed to grow from the hillside itself. Light glowed golden in the windows, promising warmth and shelter. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and she could almost taste the promise of hot food and dry clothes. It's magnificent, she breathed. It has been home to my family for 3 generations, Magnus said with quiet pride. My grandfather built the foundations, my father added the great hall, and I have strengthened the defenses. As they approached the massive oak doors, they swung open to reveal a tall woman with steel-gray hair and shrewd eyes. She wore a rich blue dress with intricate silver brooches, and her bearing suggested authority within the household. Jarl, she said with a respectful nod. We had begun to worry about the storm. Ragnhild. We have a guest, Magnus replied as he helped Astrid dismount. Astrid, Harold's daughter, this is Ragnhild, who keeps my household running with more efficiency than I manage my warriors. Ragnhild's eyes widened slightly at the name, but she stepped forward with practiced hospitality. My lady, you are welcome in this hall. Come, let us get you warm and fed. As they stepped through the doors, Astrid was immediately enveloped by warmth and the rich smells of roasting meat and fresh bread. The great hall was everything Magnus had promised. Massive timbers soaring overhead, tapestries depicting heroic deeds covering the walls, and a central hearth so large she could have stood upright within it. Ragnhild will see to your needs, Magnus said. We will speak more when you have rested. As Astrid was led away toward the women's quarters, she caught one last glimpse of Magnus speaking quietly with his men. Whatever conversation they were having, she suspected it concerned her. But for the first time in days, she felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. She was alive, she was warm, and she was under the protection of a man who had shown her more respect in one afternoon than her own family had in a lifetime. The morning brought crystal-clear skies and air so cold it burned the lungs. Astrid woke in a bed softer than any she had known, wrapped in furs and woolen blankets. Through the small window she could see the fjord spread out below, its dark waters reflecting the pale winter sun like polished metal. A gentle knock preceded Ragnhild's entrance. The older woman carried a steaming bowl of porridge sweetened with honey and dried berries, along with a cup of hot mead. The Jarl wishes to speak with you when you have broken your fast, Ragnhild said, setting the tray beside the bed. But there is no urgency. You have slept for nearly a full day. A full day? I never sleep so long. Exhaustion and safety make for powerful sleep drafts, Ragnhild replied with a knowing smile. I have prepared fresh clothes for you as well. The clothes were finer than anything Astrid had owned. A wool dress dyed deep forest green, lined with soft linen, and a thick woolen cloak in rich brown with silver clasps. The boots were of supple leather lined with rabbit fur. These are too fine, Astrid protested. I cannot accept such gifts. They are not gifts, Ragnhild replied firmly. They are necessities. The Jarl will not have a guest in his hall risk death for the sake of pride. She found Magnus in his private chamber, a smaller room adjacent to the great hall. He sat behind a massive oak desk carved with intricate knotwork, studying maps and correspondence. The room was lined with weapons that bore the marks of actual combat rather than mere decoration. You look considerably better than yesterday, Magnus observed, rising as she entered. Ragnhild's care has restored some color to your cheeks. Your household has shown me great kindness, Astrid replied, accepting the chair he offered beside the fire. I find myself in your debt. There is no debt between us, Magnus said, but there are matters we must discuss. Your presence here has already begun to create complications. Astrid's stomach tightened. What kind of complications? Magnus leaned back in his chair. A messenger arrived this morning from your father's hall. It seems your disappearance has been noticed. He pulled a sealed parchment from the desk. Your father writes to inquire whether I have seen any sign of his wayward daughter. He expresses concern for your safety and requests my assistance in locating you. He wants you to return me. He wants to know where you are and whether you pose a threat to his carefully laid plans. Magnus corrected. Erik Thorvaldsson has also sent messages suggesting that harboring a fugitive from justice would be unwise for someone in my position. Astrid felt anger rise in her chest. And what will you do? Send me back to face whatever punishment awaits? Magnus studied her for a long moment. That depends entirely on you, Astrid Harald's daughter. What is it you want? The question caught her off guard. For so long, her life had been shaped by other people's desires. I want to be free to speak truth without being punished for it. I want to live without fear of a man's fists or his anger. I want to matter, not as a political pawn but as myself. Those are not small desires, Magnus said seriously. They require strength to achieve and maintain. I have strength, Astrid replied fiercely. You have proven courage, Magnus agreed. But courage without power is often just another word for martyrdom. In this world, strength comes from alliances, from having others who will stand with you when the storms come. Something in his tone made Astrid look at him more carefully. There was an intensity in his gaze, a weight to his words that suggested deeper meaning. What are you proposing? Magnus rose and moved to the window. I am proposing a marriage, Astrid. Not the political arrangement your father sought to force upon you, but a true partnership between equals. The words hit her like a physical blow. Marriage? But you barely know me. I have nothing to offer you. No dowry, no political connections. You have exactly what I need, Magnus interrupted, turning back to face her. You have integrity. You have courage. You have the kind of strength that doesn't bend to political pressure. His expression grew serious. I am 35 years old, Astrid. I have spent 15 years building my power, securing my position, making myself strong enough to stand against any who would challenge me. But strength without purpose becomes tyranny. He moved closer, his pale eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity. I have watched lesser men compromise their honor for temporary advantage. I will not become such a man, but I need someone beside me who will ensure I never do. Someone whose moral clarity is stronger than my own ambition. And you believe I am that person? Astrid asked, her heart racing. I believe you are exactly that person, Magnus replied firmly. Yesterday, when I found you in the forest, I saw something that has become rare in our world. Someone willing to sacrifice everything rather than compromise their principles. Astrid stood and moved to the fireplace, needing time to think. If I accept your proposal, I become a target for all your enemies. My father, Erik, anyone who sees an opportunity to weaken you through me. Yes, Magnus agreed. Just as I would become a target for those who would use you. Marriage to me would make you both protected and vulnerable, powerful and endangered. And if I refuse, then I will provide you with supplies and safe passage to wherever you wish to go. You would remain under my protection until spring, and then you would be free to make your own way in the world." The offer was genuine. She could hear it in his voice. He was giving her a real choice, not maneuvering her into a corner as her father had done. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why make such an offer to a woman you met yesterday?" Magnus smiled then, the first truly warm expression she had seen from him. "Because in all my travels I have never met anyone who faced exile rather than compromise their honor. Because when I found you in that forest, half frozen and abandoned by everyone who should have protected you, you still had fire in your eyes." He moved closer. "Because I believe that together we could build something worth having. Not just power, but the right kind of power." Astrid felt something shift in her chest, a warming that had nothing to do with the fire. This man was offering her not just marriage but partnership, not just protection but purpose. "If I were to accept," she said carefully, "what would you expect from this marriage?" "Honesty between us, always," Magnus replied immediately. "Loyalty to each other above all others. Children, if the gods will it, and counsel. I would want your voice in all matters that affect our people. And if my counsel disagrees with your desires, then we would argue until we found wisdom between us," Magnus said with a slight smile. "I have no use for a wife who tells me only what I wish to hear." Astrid studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. Instead, she found only patience and what seemed to be genuine hope. The decision that had seemed impossible moments before suddenly became clear. "I accept your proposal, Magnus Eriksson," she said, her voice steady and sure. "But I have conditions of my own." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Name them. If we do this, it will be as true partners. I will not be a silent ornament in your hall. I will speak my mind, give my counsel, and act according to my conscience." She lifted her chin. "And if you ever raise your hand to me in anger, the marriage ends that moment regardless of the consequences." Magnus nodded solemnly. "Agreed, and I have one condition of my own, which is that you learn to use a sword," he said seriously. "If you are to be my wife, you will be a target. I want to know that you can defend yourself if I am not there to do it." Despite everything, Astrid found herself smiling. "I think I can manage that, my lord." "Good," Magnus replied, and then he knelt before her chair, taking her hand in both of his. "Then let me ask you properly. Astrid Haraldsdottir, will you be my wife? Will you stand beside me as we face whatever storms may come?" Looking down into his pale blue eyes, Astrid felt the last of her fear fall away. This was not her father's political arrangement. This was a choice, her choice, made freely and with full understanding of what it meant. "Yes, Magnus Eriksson, I will be your wife, and I will stand with you against any storm." As he rose and drew her to her feet, Astrid realized that her exile had not been an ending after all, but a beginning. The woman who had been cast out of her father's hall was gone forever, but the woman who would become the Jarl's wife was just beginning to discover her true strength. The announcement of their betrothal sent ripples throughout the region like stones cast into still water. Within a week, Magnus's hall buzzed with activity as preparations began for a wedding that would take place at the winter solstice. Astrid threw herself into the planning with fervor, determined to prove she was worthy of the position she would soon hold. "The Jarl wants this to be more than just a wedding," Ragnhild explained, as they sorted through bolts of cloth. "He wants it to be a statement, a declaration that his choice of bride was made from strength, not desperation." 3 weeks ago, she had been in exile with nothing but the clothes on her back. Now she was choosing between silks imported from Constantinople and wool so fine it felt like water beneath her fingers. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming," she admitted. "Dreams don't require sword lessons," Ragnhild replied with a knowing smile, nodding toward the window where Magnus could be seen in the courtyard, drilling his warriors. Every morning after breaking their fast, Magnus personally oversaw Astrid's training with blade and bow. She had been surprised by his patience as a teacher, the way he could correct her stance without making her feel clumsy. "Your instincts are good," Magnus had told her that morning as she successfully completed a series of defensive maneuvers. "You think before you act, but you don't hesitate once you've decided. That will serve you well." "In sword work or in marriage?" Astrid had asked, breathing hard. Magnus had paused, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Both, I suspect." Their relationship was developing in ways neither had expected. What had begun as a practical arrangement was evolving into something deeper, built on daily conversations that ranged from household management to philosophy, from battle tactics to dreams for their future. Magnus consulted her opinion on everything from trade negotiations to settling disputes among his people, and Astrid found herself genuinely invested in the welfare of the hall. "You're changing him, you know," Olaf, Magnus's grizzled second-in-command, told her one afternoon. "In 30 years of following the Jarl, I've never seen him so content. He's always been a good leader, but there was something missing, a hardness that came from standing alone against the world. And now?" Astrid asked. "Now he has something to protect beyond just his own power," Olaf replied. "Someone who chose to stand with him rather than someone who had no choice. It makes him stronger, but also more careful." The observation proved prophetic when, 2 weeks before the wedding, trouble arrived in the form of an unexpected visitor. Astrid was in the women's quarters, working on embroidery for her wedding dress when Ragnhild burst in with uncharacteristic urgency. "My lady, you must come quickly. Erik Thorvaldsson has arrived with a dozen armed men. He demands to speak with you." Astrid's blood turned to ice. She set down her needle with steady hands despite the fear coursing through her. "Where is Magnus?" "In the great hall, facing them down. But Erik insists that you appear before him, claims he has legal right to your person as your betrothed." Ragnhild's face was grim. "The Jarl sent me to fetch you, but also to tell you that the choice is yours. He will not force you to face Erik if you do not wish it." Astrid stood slowly, her mind racing through possibilities. She could hide while Magnus dealt with Erik, but that would make her appear weak. Or she could face her former betrothed directly and stand on her own strength. "Help me dress appropriately," she said finally. "If I am to face Erik Thorvaldsson, I will do so as the future wife of Jarl Magnus Eriksson." Ragnhild nodded approvingly and helped Astrid into her finest dress, rich burgundy wool with intricate silver trim. They braided her hair with silver ribbons and placed upon her head a circlet of silver and garnets that Magnus had given her as a betrothal gift. "Remember," Ragnhild said quietly, "you are under the Jarl's protection now. Erik cannot touch you here, cannot harm you or force you to leave." As they walked toward the great hall, Astrid could hear raised voices, Erik's arrogant tones clashing with Magnus's controlled responses. When she entered the hall, silence fell like a stone into still water. Erik stood in the center of the space, surrounded by his warriors, and Astrid was struck by how small he seemed in Magnus's hall. Where she remembered him as imposing, he now appeared petty and overdressed, his rich clothes looking garish against the austere strength of Magnus's home. Magnus stood near his high seat, flanked by his own warriors, but his posture was relaxed, confident. When he saw Astrid enter, his eyes met hers across the room and she saw both pride and protectiveness in his gaze. "Astrid," Erik's voice cracked like a whip. "There you are, my wayward bride. Your father and I have been quite concerned. Come, gather your things. We return to your father's hall immediately." "I think not," Astrid replied calmly, moving to stand beside Magnus. The positioning was deliberate, not behind him seeking protection, but beside him as an equal partner. "I am no longer your concern, Erik Thorvaldsson. Nor am I your bride." Erik's face darkened. "You are promised to me by legal betrothal contract, signed by your father. One moment of madness does not dissolve such bonds. The betrothal was dissolved the moment you demanded my exile." Magnus interjected, his voice carrying absolute authority. "By forcing Astrid from her father's hall, you released any claim you might have had." "She is not yours to claim, Magnus Eriksson," Erik snarled. "She is a runaway, a disobedient daughter who must answer for her crimes." "What crimes?" Astrid stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. "Speaking truth about your character? Defending a helpless servant from your violence? Or perhaps the crime of refusing to quietly accept marriage to a man who mistakes cruelty for strength?" Erik's hand tightened on his sword. "You forget yourself, woman. You forget your place." "No," Astrid replied with deadly calm. "I have found my place. It is here, beside a man who values honor over political convenience. I am to be wed to Jarl Magnus in 3 days' time, and nothing you say will change that." "This wedding will not take place," Erik declared, turning to Magnus. "I call upon the laws of our fathers, the ancient customs that bind us all. This woman was promised to me in lawful betrothal. Any man who takes her to wife commits theft. Magnus stepped forward, and something in his movement made Eric's warriors shift uneasily. You speak of honor, boy, but where was your honor when you struck a defenseless servant? Where was your respect for lawful bonds when you demanded exile for a woman whose only crime was holding you accountable?
She humiliated me before my own men.
Eric shouted. She spoke words no woman should speak to any man. She deserved punishment. And there, Magnus said quietly, you reveal exactly why she was right to refuse you. A true warrior protects those weaker than himself. A true leader inspires loyalty through justice, not fear. You have proven yourself to be neither. The insult hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Eric's face went white, then red, and his sword cleared its sheath with a sound like tearing silk. I will not be lectured by a brigand who steals other men's wives. Face me, Magnus Eriksson, and we will let the gods decide. Magnus didn't move for his own weapon. Instead, he smiled, a cold, predatory expression that reminded everyone present exactly why he was feared. You challenge me to single combat? Very well, but understand the stakes. If you lose, you and your men leave here immediately and never return. You renounce any claim to Astrid, and if I win, Eric demanded. You won't, Magnus replied with absolute certainty. But if you do manage to kill me, then Astrid's fate becomes her choice alone. Astrid felt fear run down her spine. She had seen Magnus fight in practice, but combat was always uncertain. Magnus, she said quietly, there is no need for this. This is no longer about you, my heart, Magnus replied, using an endearment in public for the first time. This is about honor, about the kind of man a woman like you deserves. Eric has called me thief before my own people. Such words require an answer. The formalities were quickly arranged. The great hall was cleared, its central space becoming an impromptu arena. Magnus stripped to his tunic and breeches, taking up his favorite sword, a magnificent weapon with silver wire wrapped around the grip and runes etched into the blade. Eric armed himself with his own sword, a finer weapon but one that looked somehow less lethal in his hands. First blood, or to the death? Magnus asked with formal courtesy. To the death, Eric replied immediately, and Astrid saw several of Magnus's warriors exchange concerned glances. As the two men began to circle each other, Astrid found herself holding her breath. Eric was younger, perhaps slightly faster, but Magnus moved with the fluid confidence of a man who had faced death 100 times and walked away victorious. When they finally engaged, the clash of steel on steel rang through the hall. Eric fought with fury and desperation, his attacks wild and powerful but lacking discipline. Magnus fought like water flowing around stone, fluid, patient, always in control. He parried Eric's strikes with minimal effort, occasionally landing touches that drew thin lines of blood but never pressing his advantage. You fight like an old man. Eric taunted between attacks, breathing hard. All defense, no courage for offense. Magnus smiled grimly and suddenly shifted tactics. His blade became a silver blur, weaving patterns that Eric could barely follow, much less counter. Within moments, Eric was bleeding from a dozen minor cuts, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his movements growing clumsy with fatigue. The end came suddenly. Eric, desperate and growing careless, lunged forward in a reckless attack that left him overextended. Magnus stepped aside like a dancer, his blade tracing a perfect arc that ended with its point resting against Eric's throat. Yield, Magnus said quietly. Eric's eyes blazed with hatred, but he was trapped and knew it. Blood ran from the cuts across his arms and chest, staining his fine clothes. His own sword lay on the floor where Magnus had disarmed him with a twist of the wrist that had happened too fast for most observers to follow. I yield, he gasped finally. Magnus stepped back, lowering his sword. Then gather your men and go. Spread word that Astrid Harald's daughter is under my protection, that she has chosen her own path, and that any who would dispute this choice are welcome to face me as you have done. Eric struggled to his feet, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. This isn't over, Magnus. My father will not accept this insult. You make enemies with this marriage. I have had enemies since the day I first picked up a sword, Magnus replied calmly. A few more will make little difference. As Eric and his men prepared to leave, the young man turned to Astrid one final time. You will regret this choice, Astrid. When his enemies come for him, when his hall burns and his power crumbles, Remember that you could have had a peaceful life as my wife. Peace built on the suffering of others is no peace at all, Astrid replied steadily. I choose love built on mutual respect over comfort built on fear. After Eric's departure, the hall seemed to exhale collectively. Magnus's warriors clustered around him, checking his minor wounds and praising his skill, but his eyes sought out Astrid across the crowded space. When their gazes met, she saw not triumph but concern, worry that the violence might have frightened her, that the reality of the enemies their marriage would create might cause her to reconsider. Instead, she crossed the hall to where he stood and, in full view of everyone present, took his face in her hands and kissed him. It was their first kiss, and it tasted of salt from the blood on his split lip, but also of something sweeter, the promise of shared battles, shared victories, and a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. 3 more days, she whispered against his ear. And then let them all come. We will face them together. Magnus wrapped his arms around her, holding her close while his hall erupted in cheers and laughter around them. The wedding preparations could continue. The feast could be planned. But everyone present now understood that this was more than a political alliance. This was a true partnership, forged in the crucible of conflict and sealed with courage that would echo through legend. As the winter solstice approached, bringing with it the longest night of the year, Astrid found herself thinking not of darkness but of light, the warm glow of the hearth that would soon be truly hers, the silver gleam of wedding torques being prepared by the finest smiths, and the bright fire in Magnus's eyes whenever he looked at her. She had been cast out as a troublesome daughter, but she would be wed as a warrior's equal, ready to stand beside her chosen husband against whatever storms the future might bring. The girl who had been banished from the Longhouse was gone forever, but the woman who had taken her place was stronger, wiser and utterly unafraid of the challenges ahead. Love, she had learned, was not about finding safety in another person's strength, but about discovering that together, 2 people could be stronger than either could ever be alone. In 3 days, she would bind her life to Magnus's before gods and men, but she knew now that the binding had already taken place. Not in ceremony or contract, but in the moment when 2 souls recognized in each other the partner they had been seeking all their lives. Everything else was merely celebration of a choice already made, a love already claimed, and a future already begun.